The federal government is denying any legal accountability for the cultural impact that residential schools have had on Indigenous communities. We've been reporting this morning 105 First Nations so far have signed on to a class action lawsuit seeking reparations from Ottawa. Jorge Barrera is with me now, live from Ottawa. It is his investigation that we've been talking about this morning in an online article at CBCNews.ca that he has put up. But Jorge, thank you for the time to tell us more yourself about what you've learned. The issue of reparations and this lawsuit, can you just start from the beginning and tell us what we're talking about here?
So this is the first of its kind, Heather. There has never been a lawsuit seeking collective reparations for the damage inflicted by residential schools on the nations. And this lawsuit was actually filed by Tk'emlups, and the Shishelt Nation in BC. And as we know, Tk'emlups, is the community that had the Tk'emlups Indian residential school that last week this First Nation announced that preliminary survey found the suspected remains of children on the grounds of this residential schools, and they began this lawsuit. And this lawsuit is saying, for generations, for over 100 years, our children were taken from our communities and put into these schools where their language was forced from them, their culture was forced from them. Children got punished for speaking their Indigenous language. They were forced to Christianize. And then all these children were sent back to the community year over year, with their language eroded, alienated from their culture. And this started to erode the bonds that actually hold a people together, the language and culture. And they say it's time for the federal government to give us reparations for the damage inflicted on our nation as a whole. And if we can throw a board up, this is an excerpt from the statement of claim. And it says that Canada's residential school policy ripped away the foundation of identity for generations of Aboriginal people and caused incalculable harm to both individuals and communities. Canada was also a beneficiary of the residential schools policy, as the policy served to weaken the claims of Aboriginal peoples to their traditional lands and resources. What they're saying, Canada, you benefited from residential schools. You weakened our nations, which allowed the state to make it easier to alienate us from our lands and territories. Now, the federal government says, no, we actually don't have any legal liability for the loss of language and culture, because number one, there's nothing in Canadian law that allows you to sue for compensation for the loss of language and culture. The federal government also says that the loss of language and culture was not only the result of residential schools, but other factors as well. And they say that any of these losses did actually not result from any unlawful acts or omissions by Canada or its agents. And because Tk'emlups filed this, Canada responds directly to the community's allegations of the loss of language and culture. And the federal government says that this community's loss of language and culture was the result, quote, of the unavoidable implication of children being educated in English or taught the Christian doctrine. Now, according to court records, this reparations claim is headed for trial in September of 2022. This is the first time and any residential school era claim is related to this. All other claims, like the residential school settlement agreement, the 60 scoop, and the day school settlement, all had to do with individual compensation. This is about collective harm. Heather?
So again, you mentioned this is related to the Tk'emlups Indian Residential School, Jorge. This is, of course, what we are talking about so intensely right now, but not an immediate result of this discovery just last week in Tk'emlups. This is something that goes back, as you said, 2012, the broader lawsuit filed. Is there any more about the backstory that we should know here?
Yes, this was filed 2012 and certified in 2015, and this was part of a broader claim that was also seeking compensation for what's known as day scholars. And these were residential school survivors who attended residential school in the day and then came back at home in the evening, like the people in Tk'emlups, who had a residential school in their community. And they were excluded. Most of them were excluded from the settlement agreement in 2006. They weren't allowed to apply for the common experience payment, which is basically a lump sum for attending residential schools and an extra funds for every year after. They weren't allowed to apply for this. They were allowed to seek compensation for abuse. Now, the negotiations around this class action actually stalled for a long time. And in August of 2020, they decided to split this in two. So one section would focus on the Day Scholars and their descendants, and the other one would focus on the First Nation reparations claim. And they started dealing with the Day Scholars, and then that's when the negotiations actually picked up, because the reparations issue was a sticking point, and which was one of the reasons negotiations stalled. So that is still unfolding. Now we approached the Crown Indigenous Relations Minister Carolyn Bennett's office for comment on Wednesday. We didn't get a response until actually this morning, and it came from the department, and this is the statement that they sent us. The Government of Canada is working towards righting past wrongs, and Canada deeply regrets trauma experienced by Day Scholars and is committed to justice and healing for survivors. The parties involved agree to focus efforts on the claims of the aging survivor class members and descendant class members. Heather, there was no mention of the reparations claim.
Okay. I know you'll be continuing to investigate this, Jorge, and we'll look forward to speaking with you about it further.